really appreciate you all inviting me to come back. I really enjoyed my first time being here, and I can't tell you how much of a blessing it is to be able to come back and be able to speak again. It's always a great learning experience for me, and I know it's a learning experience for everyone else that you invite to come back. And I know Micah Simpkins, who is here this morning, really appreciated the opportunity as well. I think all of us at some point in our lives have been reading or studying through the Bible and come to a passage, and we've either had one of two extremes. We either read it and we think, well, the message here is pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, and so we read it and we kind of leave it alone and we move on. Or we have the other extreme where we read a passage and we think, wow, this is really difficult, and we decide we're going to come back to it later, and then we forget about it. And I have to tell you that I had the same experience with the passage that I want to talk about tonight. I started reading in Luke chapter 11, 29 through 32, which we usually talk about Jesus and the sign of Jonah. And the first time I read it, and its counterpart in Matthew, I thought, well, this seems really simple, and the message seems pretty plain, what Jesus is trying to say. And so I moved on, and then I came back and read it, and I thought, wow, this is a lot more difficult than I originally thought, and I'll come back to it at another time. And then just recently I read it again, and I realized there is a lot in it, and I should probably take the time to study it more closely and try and understand exactly what Jesus is trying to get across to the people of His time when He says, the only sign I'm going to give to you is the sign of Jonah. And so tonight I want to share with you some observations from this passage, Luke chapter 11, verses 29 through 32. So let's read that before we begin. Beginning in verse 29, it says, when the crowds were increasing, He began to say, this generation is an evil generation. It seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah became a sign to the people of Nineveh, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. Remember, in the verses prior to this passage, Jesus did a miracle, and the result of that miracle was that a mute man spoke. And in verse 15 of the same chapter, some in the crowd said, He casts out demons by Beelzebub. And in verse 16, while others to test Him kept seeking from Him a sign from heaven. And our text tonight addresses that second seeking a sign from Him. They're asking from Jesus a sign from heaven, which is ironic because Jesus just cast out a demon and made a mute man speak. And now they're wanting a sign, as if they received no signs at all. Jesus throughout His ministry has been doing signs, and yet here they ask for a sign. Again, verse 16, while others to test Him kept seeking from Him a sign from heaven. The word test here in the original language is mentioned one other time in Luke chapter 4 in verse 2. Luke chapter 4 and verse 2, you remember that's when the devil is tempting Jesus. And in verse 2 it says, for 40 days being tempted by the devil, He ate nothing during those days, and when they were ended, He was hungry. That word tempted there is the same word in the original language as the word test here. And so when we understand that those two words are the same, it gives their request of a sign to test Him a more sinister meaning. They're not just seeking for a sign, they're trying to tempt Him. They're trying to test Him. They are trying, and I think it's important to realize that the core of their testing is the same as the temptation of the devil. They're trying to tempt Jesus to prove His deity for His own personal gain, as though everything He's done hasn't proven His deity already. And when Jesus answers their request for a sign in their testing, in verse 29, he mentions this generation. Every verse from verse 29 through 32 mentions and describes this generation. And what does this text tell us about this generation? It says it's an evil generation, and another translation says that it's a wicked translation. And this passage is paralleled in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 42. And there, it goes into a little more detail, and it says, Jesus speaks of it as an evil and adulterous generation. And so his rebuke in Matthew is even stronger than here in Luke. It's an evil generation. It's a wicked and adulterous generation. And this evil generation seeks from him a sign. You remember how Paul said that the Jews seek for signs and the Gentiles for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, to the Greeks foolishness. 1 Corinthians 1, 22 through 23. This is an evil generation, the Jews seeking for a sign. And no sign will be given to it, Jesus says, but the sign of Jonah. Now in Matthew 12, it's a little bit clearer than in Luke 11 that the sign is Jonah and the great fish. Turn over to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12 and verse 40. Here Matthew says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So what is the sign that Jesus is speaking of? Matthew's account emphasizes particularly the resurrection, and that may be the point here. It may be that Jonah himself serves as a sign, as Luke 11 says, "For Jonah became a sign to the people of Nineveh." And so maybe he will be a sign to this generation. I certainly think that it does involve Jesus' resurrection in parallel to Jonah being 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. But I think there's more to it than just that as we look further into this passage. It would not have been uncommon for a prophet to be a sign to his generation in the Old Testament. Isaiah was a prophet that was a sign to the people of his generation, as in Isaiah 8 verse 3 and 20 verse 4. And Ezekiel was also a sign to his generation. Ezekiel chapter 12 and verse 6. Ezekiel 12 and verse 6. It says here, "In their sight you shall lift the baggage upon your shoulder and carry it out at dusk. You shall cover your face that you may not see the land, for I have made you a sign to the house of Israel." So it would not be far-fetched that Jonah would be a sign not only to Nineveh, but also to the people of Jesus' generation. Prophets were often signs to the people they were speaking to. And Jesus tells us in 11:31 through 32, "But the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here." This section always confused me because I had no idea how in the world the Queen of Sheba, what that had to do with the sign of Jonah. But I think if we look closer at it, we'll find a connection. So let's look at this text more closely. One of the lessons I think that we can learn from this particular section is that the Gentiles' response to God's messengers rebukes the generation that Jesus is in. Jesus talks about this generation, his generation, and the response that these Gentiles gave to God's messengers serves as a living rebuke to the generation that Jesus is in. Do you remember the story of the Queen of the South, or the Queen of Sheba as we know her better? It's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 13, and 2 Chronicles 9, 1 through 12. And the Queen of Sheba hears from a great distance of the wisdom of Solomon and she hears that kings are coming from all over the world to visit Solomon and hear his wisdom. And she hears of his wisdom and travels a great distance herself to observe his wisdom and all that goes on in his house. And when she observes all that goes on in his palace, the text says that that there is literally no breath in her. She was overwhelmed. She was stunned. She tells Solomon, "When I heard in my own country the reports of your wisdom, I didn't believe it, but I come here and find that the half has not been told to me." She came from great distances to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and yet Jesus says something greater than Solomon is here. The word greater here in this passage in the original language is a neuter, both in verse 31 and 32. So it may be that the text isn't just saying that Jesus is greater than Solomon and Jonah, though that's certainly true. It may also be saying that his message is greater than the message of Solomon and Jonah. It may have the idea that Jesus' message, his message of the kingdom of Jesus and of forgiveness and salvation, is greater than anything Solomon and Jonah had to say. And that's greater than anything that the Queen of Sheba came to hear. And do you remember the story of Jonah? How Jonah went to the people of Nineveh and his message was 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. It's a pretty short message. But that's how it's described in Jonah chapter 3. And how did Israel at Jonah's time respond to prophets like Amos and Hosea when they gave warnings of judgment? Well, they listened to those warnings and then they didn't pay attention to them. The people of Nineveh, this wicked and corrupt Gentile city, they heard the message of Jonah, and what did they do? They listened to it, and they heard it, and they proclaimed a fast. From the highest to the lowest, they said, "We're not going to eat, and we're not even going to let our animals eat." I'm not sure how they enforced that, but they weren't even going to let their animals eat. And they said, "We're not going to eat, we're going to put on sackcloth and put our animals in sackcloth." That was the extent of their mourning. And who knows, maybe God will be merciful to us and give us forgiveness. These Gentiles and their response to God's messengers like Jonah and to Solomon, they are a rebuke to the people of Jesus' generation. Right here, in their presence, they have Jesus. And they have His message, and He's doing miracles and signs. He's healing the blind. He's making the mute speak. Something that Solomon could, in all of his glory, could never have done. And yet, they want a sign from Him. And they need more proof. The people, these Gentiles, are a rebuke against this generation because of the way they responded to the message of God's messengers. Now, if you look at the book of Isaiah, you'll find passages that describe Gentiles bowing down to Jews. And of course, the Jews loved those passages. They would love to read how the Gentiles were going to bow down to them. And for example, let's read Isaiah chapter 45 and part of verse 14. Isaiah 45 and verse 14. The Bible says, "Thus says the Lord, the wealth of Egypt and the merchandise of Cush and the Sabaeans, men of stature, shall come over to you and be yours. They shall follow you, they shall come over in chains and bow down to you. They will plead with you, saying, Surely God is in you, and there is no other, no God beside Him." Who is Isaiah talking about? Well, he mentions Egypt, Cush, and the Sabaeans, and the point is that these Gentiles are going to come bowing down to the Jews, and the Jews cherished those promises. If they could have, they would have underlined those verses in their Bibles and cherished those promises. But the Gentiles here, the text says, these Gentiles aren't going to bow down to you. They're going to rise up in condemnation and judgment and rebuke you in the day of judgment. In so much of the reading outside of the Bible and in the Bible, I have been, and in the lives I've been blessed to be around, I have seen how people can serve as a living sermon for us about the importance of listening to God. There are so many inspiring people who inspire us maybe by their attendance at worship even when they don't feel like it, by them doing so much when they don't feel like it. And I know that there are definitely people where I go to church back in Nashville and over in Brandon that are like that for me. I see that they are always in the pew even though they don't feel like it. And I'm sure you know people like that who are just inspiring by their example. And these people are living sermons to us just like these Gentiles were living sermons, or should have been, for the Jews of Jesus' generation. And those people who are living sermons for us, those who serve in that capacity for us, they're here and they come to worship because they want to listen to God, which is something we should all learn from, and it's something that Jesus' generation should have learned from. While this passage does teach that Jesus' message is greater than the message of Jonah and of Solomon, it also teaches us about the greatness of Jesus. Jesus is greater. Greater than the wisdom of Solomon. If the Queen of Sheba would travel great distances from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, how much more should the people of Jesus' generation have done to listen to the wisdom of Jesus? If the men of Nineveh heard Jonah preach 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown, and they all changed their ways and redirected their focus in their lives, how much more should the people of Jesus' generation hang on every word of Jesus and listen to what He says? He is greater than Solomon. He's greater than Jonah. And it's interesting in the Gospel of John, when Jesus has that conversation with the woman at the well, in John 4, 7 through 14, she says, "You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you?" And the question is asked in John 8, when Jesus is talking about how Abraham rejoiced to see his day. They say, "You're not greater than Abraham, are you?" These people are asking Him in stunned disbelief, "Are you trying to compare yourself to Jacob and to Abraham?" Someone far greater than Jacob and Abraham was right there in their presence, and they just didn't realize it. And the lesson is the same for us. If we would go great distances to pursue our passions, our hobbies, whatever it may be, to do other things, how much more should we be motivated to go great distances to pursue Jesus and to pursue His Word, to pursue a relationship with Him? And this passage also reminds us of how horrible judgment will be for those who reject Jesus. This point has been stressed before. Remember back in Luke 10 when Jesus sent out the 70 on the limited commission. He tells them to go into these cities and to preach the kingdom of God has come near. And He tells them if they reject the message, those people will be judged. Luke chapter 10 and verse 12, He says, "I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town." And verse 13 and 14, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable in the judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you." And here in Luke 11, Jesus says that these people are going to rise up against you and condemn you at the judgment. The fact that we will all give an account to Jesus and to God at the judgment was an ever-present reality in the teachings of Jesus. He keeps drawing attention to it. He keeps reminding them of that. He reminds them that we are going to stand before God, we're going to give an account before God, and to refuse to listen to Jesus has catastrophic consequences. I wonder what it would have been like to see the destruction on Sodom and Gomorrah as fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. I think it would have been a horrible thing to see. But it will be better in the day of judgment for those cities than for those who reject Jesus. I want to look with you at a few more aspects of the sign of Jonah here to see what Jesus is saying to this wicked generation. We've already noted that the sign of Jonah includes the reception of the Gentiles, that the Gentiles give to the message as compared to how Jesus' generation receives His message. And we've noted how Jesus is far greater than Jonah or Solomon ever was, and how this generation should have seen that but missed it. But think about the story of Jonah a little closer, and how Jesus may be using it here. Jonah is certainly no comparison to Jesus. When told by God that he should go preach to Nineveh, Jonah runs away, and he gets on a ship on the way to Tarshish, and a great storm arises, and the sailors are crying out to their gods in desperation. And they come to Jonah and they call on him to cry out to his God in a desperate attempt at being saved. And they cast lots to find out who has caused this storm to come upon them, and they find Jonah guilty. And Jonah confesses to his crime. Jonah chapter 1 and verse 12 is where he does that. Jonah 1 and verse 12, Jonah says, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." And so the men throw him into the sea. And verse 17 says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Remember, Matthew 12 emphasizes this aspect of Jonah's story in reference to Jesus' death and resurrection, being in the ground 3 days and 3 nights. So how does this aspect of the story play a part in the sign of Jonah other than the obvious 3 days and 3 nights reference? Well, for a long time when I read the story of Jonah, I looked at the great fish coming up and swallowing Jonah as Jonah's judgment. But the more I've read this story, I think that that's not the case, but rather the great fish was Jonah's salvation. Notice what Jonah says in his prayer in chapter 2, beginning in verse 2. "I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and You heard my voice. For You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All Your waves and Your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from Your sight. Yet I shall again look upon Your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet You brought me up, but You brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to You into Your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to You what I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord." I think this passage teaches that the storm was Jonah's judgment, and the great fish was his salvation. And I think this right here is crucial to understanding what Jesus is saying in the sign of Jonah. I think what Jesus is saying is Jonah was dying. And those 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish were, as Jonah puts it in chapter 2, salvation. I think Jesus is saying in Matthew 12, "This is my sign to you. Just as Jonah was saved from death by God's salvation, so my death and resurrection by my spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, like Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so you will find your salvation, just as Jonah did." Though I think that comes with a caveat. That part of that may be that they have to have a truly penitent heart in order to receive that salvation. The kind of penitent heart that I think we see in Jonah's prayer here in Jonah chapter 2. Now, I'm not saying Jonah was perfect. He certainly isn't. But here, at least in chapter 2, his prayer seems to be sincere in gratitude to God. And I think this is just as important for us to understand. Jesus spent those 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth so that we might have salvation. And if we ignore that, if we do not come to Him with true penitence, with sorrow, if we don't seek Him, then surely Nineveh and the Queen of Sheba will rise up in condemnation of us. For we will all be guilty of the same things that this wicked generation in Jesus' day were guilty of. That is crucial to the sign of Jonah, the only sign that will be given to them. And I think this ties into the message of Jonah, which I think we find in Jonah chapter 4, in verse 2. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Yes, Jonah. That's exactly right. That's what God gave to you when He saved you with that great fish. And yet you're angry that He did the exact same thing for Nineveh? That He saved them when they turned to Him? God is indeed merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and we would do well to see that. The final aspect of this sign that I want to look at with you ties in, I think, to the rest of these points. And that is that Jesus is showing this wicked generation just how much they're like Jonah. And that is not a compliment, judging by the way Jonah's story ends. Jonah preaches this message to the people of Nineveh, and they repent and they turn away from their sins, and Jonah is angry at the mercy of the Lord. He hates the Assyrian people, and he wants God to wipe them out. But when he sees God isn't going to do that, as Jonah says, as Jonah 1:4 says, he was angry. To me, the blindness and ingratitude of Jonah is unbelievable. He had already had a sign of God's mercy in that God has saved his own life, and yet when it comes right down to it, he ignores that sign because he cannot stand the sight of Nineveh being saved. Does that remind you of anyone? It reminds me a whole lot of the wicked generation in Jesus' day. They'd already seen the signs that Jesus had done. They'd seen Jesus' love and mercy and His deity proclaimed, and how often has Jesus declared His love for the Jews. Remember in Matthew 23:37 when He says, I would have gathered you under my wings. And yet despite all of those signs, they will not see Jesus. And like Jonah, they cannot accept the salvation of a people, the Gentiles, that they hate. It's heartbreaking. And this is a lesson that we all must learn. Because how often in our own lives have we seen the many and wonderful signs of God displayed in our lives? How many times have we seen the mercy and love of God working in our lives? And how many times have we completely and utterly disregarded them? How many times have we been guilty of the sin of that wicked generation, in that we see the signs and we refuse to seek the one who gives them to us? It is a shame to see people who have so obviously been blessed by the Lord throw it all away because they will not seek Him. And it is heartbreaking to see people who have received the love and mercy of Jesus and who have not called out as Jonah did in his brief moment of penance, but I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And sadly, we can be guilty of the other half of this problem. Sometimes we disregard the fact that God has saved us and look on in disbelief and anger and resentment like Jonah, that God could have the same mercy on someone we would see as the worst of sinners and undeserving of God's love. And that's just hypocrisy, and we must guard against it. Because we are all the worst of sinners. And we should never scorn someone who has received the grace of God with thanksgiving and joy like the Jews did and like Jesus taught against here. The sign of Jonah holds a lot in it. More than I realized at first when I first read it, and even the second time I read it, or the many times I read it after that. And it holds many serious aspects. aspects that we must pay attention to and resolve within ourselves, that we will no longer disregard the signs in our own lives that we have already seen, but that we will take them with thanksgiving, and that we will continue to seek God, and that we will embrace those who we may have considered the worst of sinners into His fold when He accepts them. God's message is indeed greater than Solomon and Jonah, and Jesus is greater than both of them. So I encourage you, I encourage me, and I encourage all of us to pay attention to the wisdom of God's Word. If you're not a Christian tonight, this is your opportunity to make your life right with Him, to come to Him with penance and true humility, and to take His yoke upon you because He wants you and He wants to have a relationship with you. If you are a Christian and your life hasn't been what He wants it to be, come to Him. The people here will be glad to help you. If there's anything that we can do for you this evening, please come forward as we stand and as we sing together.